Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on for the third time, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Last time he was on was episode 384 back in January. I feel like we have you on about once a year now at this point. It usually
Yeah,
seems to be around like this time of year, but really appreciate you coming back on. I've always had good kind of feedback on your episodes. Obviously want to get back on here to pick your brain on a few things, but yeah, thanks for coming back on.
yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's always fun and insightful chats with you. I feel like you have a ton of knowledge and you can really go pretty deep on many topics here. So, I guess for you, since it's been since basically the beginning of the year since we've had you on, anything happened in 2024? Anything big like that? Any updates on your end or anything like that?
The biggest project this year is working on 3 books, which I don't recommend to work on 3 books in a
Yeah.
year. I should say probably really 2 because the third one I feel bad got pushed off because of the other 2. You have all these plans of all the deadlines like spaced out and then they all just get scrunched on top of each other. So finally finishing up the Triphasic 2 book with Coach Cal Dietz, University of Minnesota. So that's all new stuff. So there's 14 new methods. And we took the approach of if you were so Triphasic 1 is like the micro version. So you have your eccentric, your isometric, and your concentric portion. And then all the programs and everything is based around that. So the second one then is if you take those concepts and now you zoom out to more of a macro view, like what does your warm up look like? How do you train for specific things using like the tri-block system? So you're going to look at speed, power, and strength, and then also different methods like the Supermax method. And then how do you then transfer that? So the 3 components of the new book are turn on, that's your warm-ups, things like he's got like the go drill, RPR, your training, different types of training, how do you train for different phases, different training methods. And the third phase is then how do you transfer that to the field? So we're getting that finished up. Hopefully when this is live, it'll hopefully be out by then. I'm just actually proofing the print version this morning. And then doing a book on metabolic flexibility,
So,
co-author Gianna Massey, she's an RD. That's for human kinetics, which will hopefully be out in 2025 sometime. I'm not sure when. And then finishing up a book I did with my buddies, Dean and Jeb, on the high flux method for kind of health and body composition, with the main emphasis being on people just need to walk and move more.
right. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. No, that's all. So 3 books coming out, the triphasic one. And then we have, you said the metabolic flexibility, which that's something I feel like a lot of people come to you for that information. Was there anything, I guess, new in that? Obviously it's a new book in general, but was there anything that's been like that you've added to anything there in the last little bit with that? Or is it just everything that you've learned over the last X amount of years?
Yeah, the idea was to do it as an intermediate level. So so here's a little bit on what metabolic flexibility is, how to increase it. And then we have basically 8 interventions of how to walk people through the system if they want to become more metabolically flexible. Very similar stuff to what I do in the Flex Diet Cert, but it's going to be a book, so it's not going to be we're not going to have 30 hours of stuff in the book. It's going to be a much more simplified version of that. And yeah, just trying to make it practical. We're still trying to figure out exactly what level to have it be at. It's going to be pretty heavily referenced, but we're trying to hit that intermediate area where people are not brand new to it, but they still want something that can also be useful as they learn about a new theory. So that's where we are now in the process. We submitted all the rough drafts in July. We got the go ahead last January. So we have all that stuff done. It's just trying to do more of the organization and figure out the final tone. And right now we've got, I think, 8 other experts who wrote little short side sections and stuff for it too. So yeah, trying to make it more of a complete system that people can buy for pretty inexpensive price. I don't know what the final price will be, but it probably won't be too bad.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think you said, was it an RD that you had?
Yeah, my friend Gianna Massey.
Was she any insights that she brought or any reason you decided to team up with her on that topic?
She does really great stuff. I've known her for years. So honestly, I knew she'd be easy to work with. And then she has a lot of practical application. And then the reality is, it's probably public, but whatever. Major book outlets still want someone who's an RD on nutrition stuff.
Makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah. So having her on it has been helpful. And the reality is, I knew I didn't have, with the schedule, I knew I didn't have time to do all of it myself. And so it's been nice to, hey, can you help with this section? And then while you're working on that, I'll go work on this project. And then, okay, now I'm going to revise what you did. So we can go back and forth. So I'm not the single weight limiter all the time. So it's just been super, super helpful.
And then the third one was the kind of high energy kind of flux, right? Concept there with that. I guess really with that, the big thing is I'm sure the main takeaway is from a body comp standpoint and everything like that. And I think you said health and kind of longevity too is just basically move more, right? And I'm sure the concept there is you can also eat a bit more, right? And everything like that too.
Yeah, the idea is that yes, you can lower your caloric expenditure to this mythical. If you're a guy, it seems to be 1,800 calories. If you're a woman, it seems to be 1,200 calories, which I don't really know where those ever came from. And will that work? Yes. The caveats are if you're doing anything performance related, that's probably not going to go so well. And you're living in a world where calories are being pushed at you all the time for various reasons. So our argument is to, instead of trying to white knuckle your way through life, just increase your caloric expenditure. So it allows you to eat more calories because you're burning more calories. Obviously, doing exercise is great, doing some type of weightlifting, doing some type of cardiovascular, bazillions of different books on that. And our argument is that walking up to a certain threshold is probably the easiest way for most people to make up that difference in energy expenditure. There's all sorts of different studies about how much people actually move per day. I've seen everything from 3,500 steps to even 5,000 steps a day. It's definitely not 10 to 12,000 steps a day. It's definitely low for most people. So if you can just slowly over time just walk more, most people don't have any restrictions to that. It doesn't require a warm-up. Doesn't require special equipment. You can do it anywhere. Then in terms of people with busy lifestyles, that's probably going to be their biggest leverage point.
So for you guys, the kind of main thing is increase it via, like you said, walking and stuff like that. That's obviously we still, like you said, want to do the strength training, cardio and stuff like that. But most people tend to not do the kind of the walking, like just normal day-to-day activities, usually pretty sedentary. So that would be a way that we'd want to, that you guys talk about increasing via that.
Because I've had clients in the past where they're like, oh, but I'm strength training now and I'm doing some cardio stuff and I'm still not losing weight. And this happened years ago, like before wearables were a thing. I used to put the old school little pedometers on people and realized, oh my God, some of these people were only walking like 2,000 steps a day. And I remember the first smartwatch I got, I was looking at my little photos that popped up. Was it a Basis watch in 15 or something? And I was doing my PhD at that time. So I put a little sticker over it to not know how many step count I got. And I didn't have it on during training. And most of my work was computer work at that point. I wasn't going into the lab. I was just writing up my dissertation. I think I got 8 steps the whole day, which is freaking absolutely horrible.
You basically went to the bathroom.
Yeah, I basically got up out of my chair, went to the bathroom, and that was about it. And on one level, if someone asked me, they would say, hey, did you not move much today? I would have said, oh, definitely. If they said, do you think your step count is below 1,000? I would have said, no way. I was probably at least 3,000 to 4,000 because nope, not even close.
And I feel like this may have had been out in the research for longest of time, but I feel like recently, at least it's popped up about the importance of not only getting that overall movement in, but also trying to, break it up throughout the day and just make sure you avoid long period of time of being sedentary as well too. So I didn't know if that was anything you guys took into consideration there with that.
In the perfect world, if you can do more frequency, that's going to be better. We know that on the physiologic level, this contracting muscle, which walking, doing a few bodyweight squats, push-ups, whatever, that is actually going to pull glucose directly out of the bloodstream independent of insulin, or what's called insulin independent glucose uptake. So we know all those things are super important. There's some interesting studies on people that are borderline diabetic by just having them do the exercise snacks, they call them, during the day. Much better glucose regulation. From a muscle standpoint, your muscles don't feel as stiff and sore because they're getting moved through a whole range of motion, posture stuff, everything else. So there's just tons of benefit. At first, yeah, just do what you can to hit whatever your step count is. And if you could split that up a little bit more and try to be a little bit more active during the day, I do think that is going to be better. How much better is probably up for debate. So it's just like protein, like probably hit your total number of grams of protein per day and then worry about distribution. But the reality is if you're at 12,000 steps per day, most people are probably going to break that up. They're probably not doing one walk of like 11,000 steps and being a sea slug the rest of the time.
Yeah. So like you said there, I like the kind of comparison to protein. It's at the end of the day, don't really work in as much as you can, worry about the overall kind of the day. What does that look like? And then from there, it's probably a little bit better to split it up. But like you said, same thing with protein. It's if you're going to get 200 grams of protein, you're probably not doing that all in one meal anyways. You're going to probably at least get 2 to 3 out of it. So the same concept there. So from a like overall kind of, because I guess overall, what are you like looking at here? Is there any kind of numbers that, hey, here's a minimum of what you'd want to try to hit? What do you typically say there?
If you go for a number, my biased opinion, that is pretty good bang for your return, right? Because people want to know, hey, well, like exactly what is the air quotes best number? Sure, if you could walk more, would that be better? Yes, most of the data shows up to maybe 13 to 15,000 steps per day is probably the max. Will you still see a little bit of a benefit after that? Yes, but the curve tends to flatten out. That works from Herman Ponzer's lab. I would say the data I've seen is probably around 8,000, 8,500. Most people, if they're doing cardiovascular training, they're doing some weightlifting, and they're hitting a step count of 8,000 steps per day. And their goal is not necessarily weight loss. That's probably fine. I wouldn't really be too worried about that. The 10,000 steps per day was a made up number, although there is some data to support that. So a lot of people crap all over that number. It did turn out it's still a pretty good proxy, but I would say 8,000 to 12,000 per day. It's probably your kind of sweet spot.
Yeah, that's usually find that's that sweet spot. And then once you get past that, and I think you mentioned this, yeah, you're still going to see some benefit from it probably, but then it really is like a kind of cost, time benefit type situation where it's, hey, can you dedicate the time to it? And you're also probably going to get, like you said, you're still going to see results from it, but maybe some diminishing returns there as you get to the higher end of that number there.
Yeah, and I just had this conversation with a client the other day. If you have more of a sedentary job, which a lot of people do, knowledge workers now, or even online coaching, etc., and your goal is 12,000 steps per day, that probably takes a fair amount of time. Like you're probably going to have to either do one really long dedicated walk or something in the morning and something in the evening. So trying to go beyond that a lot of times just from a pure time perspective becomes restrictive also.
Yeah, I feel like at that point it just becomes about like, all right, how can we like maybe pair a couple things together, whether that be you take phone calls doing it or listening to podcasts, something along those lines on there to kill two birds with one stone there. Last question I do want to bring up on this, because you did mention Herman Ponzer. I know he's brought the concept of, maybe he hasn't, but I know he talks about it a lot, is exercise energy compensation. Is that anything that like you feel like people need to worry about with getting these higher steps, or anything you consider there?
My bias again is from my interpretation of the research. Yeah, it is a thing, right? Because people want to think that everything is linear, and almost nothing in physiology is linear. The only thing that's really linear in physiology is heart rate with exercise intensity is probably as close to linear as we have. So I've often joked that, because my master's is in mechanical engineering, that physiology is associated with every quote bad engineering word. It's anisotropic, it's chaotic, it's nonlinear, it doesn't follow predictive straight models. And so I think people's assumption is, oh, if I go from 5,000 steps per day to 8,000 steps per day, that's an increase of 3,000. That's going to be good. I'd say, yeah, that's good. But now if I go from 15,000 steps per day to 18,000, I'm going to see that same linear benefit. And the answer there is no, not really. And at some point, if you get really high end on the end of the models, you run into maybe not having enough energy in the system. So you end up with relative energy deficit syndrome or REDS or other issues like that, which I have run into a few people. Again, these people are not very common. One person in particular I did a call with, he was walking 21,000 steps per day. And his intake was very low. He's still strength training, still doing cardio. And I'm like, bro, you just need to walk less. He's like, oh, but I heard walking was good. I'm like, you're in such a massive energy restriction now that performance was crappy, didn't feel good. So I think, yeah, if you get too far out of that into the model, it's going to try to break down. However, is that something most people need to worry about? Hell no.
Right.
Like, most people are not walking 15,000 steps a day and reporting issues. So I feel like sometimes it's a real thing, but it's also not realistic for 99% of the population.
And I feel like too, the people that kind of Herman Potzer looked at were people that did at least work in these like hunter-gatherer type tribes, and they're obviously not consuming the same amount of calories that most people would be consuming. So I think really the takeaway here is, yes, if you pair it with not eating enough, terrible recovery, that's maybe where it starts to add up. But again, one of the benefits of adding this movement in is you can eat a little bit more, but you need to make sure you're obviously doing that in the process. And I feel like people took Herman's kind of work and were then, oh, so you're saying exercise is bad? And it's definitely not the case at all. It's just, again, it's the other inputs that we need to look at with that too.
Yeah. And if you look at the stuff from like my buddy, Dr. Brent Ruby, who's done acute studies on firefighters, there is probably a max of how much energy you can physically put out every day in and day out.
Yeah.
Like you can see some crazy outputs for a couple days, but those outputs are not sustainable. And that kind of makes sense, right? If your body is very survival based, it's thinking, oh my God, you're trying to out fighting forest fires for 10, 12 hours a day. You have this massive caloric expenditure. You can't sustain that for long periods of time, right? So if you look at some endurance races that are multiple days, there also appears to be a higher end of how many calories you can expend day in and day out, which makes sense. But again, do the vast majority of people ever need to worry about that? No. Like 99% of people are going to do better with all things being equal. Time's normally going to be the biggest constraint at some point. I just want you to move more and eat more. My buddy Lonnie Lowry says, move more, eat more, be more. Most
With
people, if they
good.
have the time, that would be the direction that I would push them for even performance and body comp changes.
Yeah, because I feel like I don't know. This is something that I'd be curious to hear if this is what you've seen, but I feel like people maybe overemphasize overtraining and stuff, and it gets people to be afraid of like exercising more. But again, like we talked about, it's probably more the recovery and the time more so than anything that you would need to be concerned about than actual exercising too much. Because again, like you said, there are limits to that, but most people aren't gonna get there anyways at any point.
Yeah, and the handful of people I've done consults with, or they've emailed me their programs that they were complaining about overtraining. I would argue their programs are pretty stupid.
And that's poor programming.
Yeah, very poor programming.
So interesting on that you mentioned, because I did hear that actually recently about how, like you said, there is a limit to how much we can expend from a energy standpoint. And like you said, for a couple of days you could probably do a lot, but like over extended periods of time, there's a max there. What about the energy end? Is that part of it as well too? Do you think there's a limit for people there as well too?
There seems to be. Again, it's hard to say what exactly that limit is. It probably has to do with assimilation and digestion
Yeah.
and all the other processes that go in it. There's some super interesting cases. So a guy I did some consulting with, he is currently you can look him up on Instagram. I think his handle is Fear Vana, but Akshay is currently crossing Antarctica. So
Wow.
he's working to be the first individual to do a solo crossing of the entire continent of Antarctica unsupported. So he is pulling everything that he needs for, I think it's a 155-day trip. And so if you get into like extreme examples like that, where he's literally on skis pulling a sled almost every hour of the day, plus you have to bring all your own food, it's interesting to see that most of the other explorers he's talked to, and when I was talking to him about this, like he called it, he's trying to get his polar belly. Like he's literally trying to add more fat stores before he leaves because
Yep.
you are going to run up against those limits where you're just going to lose weight. Now, he has a little bit of an advantage that he's doing moderate to lower intensity exercise, but just a crap ton of it all the time. So it's not so much an exercise intensity issue per se, which again doesn't mean that it's easy by any stretch of imagination because nobody's done this before. But pretty much all the people you talk to, and he would agree that you don't want to go into that super lean. Like you want to have some reserves because you even trying to eat as much as you can, which again, you've got logistics issues with that. Carrying all of it, it's a fine balancing act because in theory he could bring a lot more food, but that's going to cost him a lot more energy expenditure in order to pull all
Yeah.
of said food. So yeah, it's to those cases or even like ultra endurance events where they can fuel as much as they want. There does appear to be a cap on that. Also gets into, are you running? Are you skiing? Are you walking? Biking? Biking seems to get by a little bit better. So there's probably less GI distress. Years ago, I was a support person for the RAM race or the Race Across America. So we had a 4-person team. We started in San Diego, California. So one of the 4 people was riding at all times, and it's a 7-day race or whoever finishes first. And then you finish in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And it was interesting just to see food consumption on that. And just at some point, you're just trying to eat as much as humanly possible. But a lot of times you're going to run into GI distress. And one of the guys I remember, we're freaking somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. We had a lot of prepackaged foods because you're bringing all your food with. You could run and do grocery stops. And I asked him, I said, hey, you just got done riding pretty intense 4-hour shift. I showed him the little container of this pre-mixed protein carbohydrate thing. And he's like, if you even show me that container again, I'm going to vomit all over you. I'm like, okay. I'm guessing you don't want any more of this. He's like, hell no. So I'm like, oh, crap. I said, what sounds good? He's like, Fig Newtons. I'm like, okay. So I don't know how many sleeves of Fig Newtons he ate for the next 3.5 days.
I was going to ask you that. I figured if that's the case, it's like you almost just really need to increase the calorie density of the diet, right? Finding things
Yep.
that are going to be like, again, things that we would tell people not to do normally, but you're going to try to find things that are going to pack a ton of calories and not a lot of work to have to digest it and everything like that.
Yeah. And even like the things they call like taste fatigue, if you have so much of, say, said sports drink, whatever, like after a while, like your brain is just, "Ew, I don't want any more of that. That just sounds like a horrible idea." So even rotating flavors, having stuff that's unflavored, a lot of that kind of stuff. This is all like at the ultra high end. Like you're literally racing across the US. Like we finished third behind the two professional teams. And I want to say the distance between third and fourth was a minute and a half or maybe 61 seconds or something. Just crazy. They think that an almost 7 day race comes down to friggin' seconds is just mind blowing.
Yeah. That's insane. That's super cool though. I think that stuff is fun to, like you said, it's not going to be really matter for most people, but it is super interesting to think about that stuff, right? The guy that you said is going to go across Antarctica like that. That's insane. Like you said, it's so you got to find that perfect balance of, like you said, enough body fat, but then you don't want to have too much body fat, but then you also need to make sure that you bring enough food, but then you don't want to bring too much food. It's crazy to think how all these things can impact each other there with that.
Yeah, he was cutting like his toothbrush in half, cutting the labels off his clothes. He's like, anything I can do to save like a couple grams here and there, like I'm gonna do, which yeah, pretty wild.
When is he doing that?
He's doing it right now. So you
Okay, in the
can
middle of
follow
it.
him on Instagram. He's got little daily updates, which are actually pretty cool. Yeah, I will tag him in the little show notes. But yeah, super fascinating guy. And man, that would pretty crazy.
Yep. It just, I know some of the stuff I want to talk about today in your physiologic flexibility class. I'm sure, some of that stuff in terms of like just adapting to it, like it's going to be super important there. But before we dive into that, I did just want to touch on, I think something that people are like a lot more interested in lately is like cognition and like brain health and stuff like that. So I just wanted to pick your brain on what are some ways to support optimal cognition? What would you say are the big things? And then maybe we have some smaller things that we could potentially look at with that too.
Yeah, so big thing. So I'm a associate professor at the Carrick Institute. So they do a lot of functional or clinical neurology. So check them out. They have a ton of stuff in that area. So I would definitely check them out. The two top things I would say are one, aerobic training. We know aerobic training can increase hippocampal volume in the brain, which is going to result in better cognitive processing. I think a lot of meatheads probably still don't do quite enough cardio, especially even if their goal is more longevity, cognition. Like I know I'm not a big fan of doing cardio, to be perfectly honest, but I know I feel so much better when my aerobic base is higher. My recovery is better. I can focus on tasks much longer. And even like on cardio day, so tomorrow's a cardio day for me, I'll either schedule it first thing in the morning. So I'll have like now that I'm back home, just a base level of cardio I'll do most mornings, schedule permitting. And then on the days I'm doing more dedicated stuff, I'll do it mid-afternoon. And so I find that's a nice break where I feel like I can then go do more cognitive tasks even after. So I think it's a twofold benefit. You get the acute benefit where you feel like you can concentrate better after, and then you get the kind of chronic adaptation benefit. The second one I would say is, especially for fitness people, for God's sake, have some type of recreation. I've even joked, hell, even pickleball is acceptable, right? Just do something where you're learning new movements. Ideally, you're playing in a what I call semi-predictable environment, whether it's pickleball, tennis, surfing. I do a lot of kiteboarding. Anything where you have to interact in an environment that's kind of predictable, but you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Like on a deadlift, unless earthquakes or things happen, like the bar is not moving. Like you know exactly where the damn bar is going to be like all the time. But if you're surfing or you're kiteboarding, you don't know exactly what's going to happen with the wind, the waves. You have to coordinate all that. And even pickleball, like hand-eye coordination, you don't know exactly where the ball is going to end up. Lateral movement, non-sagittal movements, and just learning a new skill at the same time. I think there's plenty of studies on that. I often joke that as people get older, they end up being a sea slug. So if you've ever seen the story, the sea slug is this little critter that floats around in the ocean. And then once it finds a rock, it attaches itself to the rock and then it eats its own brain because it doesn't even have to coordinate movement at all. The food just flows by and it just exists there. So I feel like people have become way too close to a sea slug lately. Like even, yeah, if you do exercise, that's great. But try to add more novelty and then not just doing a preacher curl now instead of a hammer curl. Get out of your environment, do something different. And the thing you can do as an interim is I've actually taught a lot of people to juggle. Not that you have to be a professional at it, but try to juggle at least 3 balls and then practice that. Can you walk around? Can you change your visual gaze? Can you do other things? Because that's a new task for most people. It's coordinating hand-eye motor movements. It costs you maybe 3 tennis balls, so it's cheap. You can do it inside if it's freezing ass cold, like it is now in Minnesota. So that's a workaround if you're not able to do any recreation.
Yeah, I like both of those, and like I like the kind of learning a new skill, but like you said, make sure it's something outside of, like you said, aerobic training or strength training, because it's like those things are, like you said, unless an earthquake happens, it's like you know what's going to happen there. So do something that you're going to have to use, like some hand-eye coordination, stuff like that. And you mentioned, I think, what was it? What was the phrasing? Semi predictable, right?
Yeah, were you like even like kiteboarding, which I do a lot of, the wind is predictable. It's probably not gonna, if the wind's out of the north, it's probably not gonna spontaneously change to the south. But there's gusts that come up and down. It's not always constant. You have waves, you're moving through your environment. And then if you're trying to interact in it, you're trying to do a 20-foot jump and land it, or your back roll or whatever. You're interacting in a environment that's semi-predictable, or like surfing. Yes, you're on a wave, but every wave is just a little bit different. So things where you know what to expect. And then even better, if you have immediate feedback of success or not success. So if I do a 20-foot jump and I get dropped out of the sky like a sack of potatoes and don't land it, it's pretty obvious feedback that I screwed up the landing or the takeoff on it. So having that feedback where you play pickleball, you miss the ball or it doesn't go where you want, I think having that immediate feedback then allows your brain to iterate and kind of auto correct too. I think that would be more of a like a perfect scenario.
So it sounds like, would this be like any type of like kind of sport essentially that you could do, like
Yeah.
in a way, anything like that? And what would take it to the next level of, like you said, this is semi predict. What would be like completely? Is there anything that would be like unpredictable that you could?
The more crazy the conditions get, it gets harder unless you have a very high skill level. So, for example, kiteboarding, if the wind is much, much higher and it's super gusty, yeah, professionals can operate and do crazy jumps and stuff in that environment. I'm not so good because my reactions have to be so much faster and my ability to predict and to change has to be so much faster that if I don't have a high enough requisite skill level, everything just sucks and it's just almost too hard, right? It's just, if you've never deadlifted before, unless you're Andy Bolton, it's, hey, let's just start at 405. It's like, it's probably too much. You're not going to make a lot of progress there. But with external environments, you don't have a lot of time to control the environment. You just have to operate in it. So you'd have to find a way to try to scale it. So with kiteboarding, maybe you're going to ride slower, do smaller jumps, use a different size kite. You're going to try to change your things to try to operate in more of an unpredictable environment. The waves, like you get waves that are really variable. That's going to make it hard to figure out timing and everything else.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? It's like you're doing something like physical, but it also, like you said, keeps that hand-eye coordination. It can move your body in different directions. You have to stay dynamic with that. But then also like mentally as well, too. I'm sure there's obviously the mental component, which is why we're talking about the cognition side, where, that's going to help you stay sharp from that standpoint. Whereas, like you said, most people, they become the sea slug where they just sit at their desk, go home, watch TV, do some stuff around the house, and then that's like kind of all they do. They don't ever do anything like mentally stimulating from that perspective. But I didn't really think about that beforehand. I thought maybe mentally stimulating from learning something, but again, having it be something physical, I could really see the benefit there. What about the dose? Yeah, I guess the frequency of either of these. Is there anything we're looking for there, or anything on these?
I don't know. I'd have to ask my buddy, Dr. Tommy Wood would be much more of an expert on that area. Yeah, I don't know exactly on dosing, to be honest. Usually with most people I consult with, I'm like, just do some of it.
Something.
And the reality is you may be stuck with what you can get. So kiteboarding, my schedule has to align and the wind has to be pretty good. So I'm waiting on a kind of external environments on that.
Gotcha.
But if you can control it, like all things being equal and you've got time, I'd just do more of it. If you're playing pickleball in a perfect world, you'd want to play more often against someone who's just a little bit better than you. If you play against a really advanced person, they just smash it over your head all the time. Probably not learning a whole lot.
Yeah.
But if you can take an advanced person, or same with BJJ, whatever, and you can get them to scale their output to just above you, then that's probably going to be a little bit better. So some of the things that we think about.
Yeah, no, I figured that'd be the case. Hey, just do it at least once. And then obviously if you can do more, that's probably going to be better from that standpoint there. And then from the aerobic training side, you mentioned that. Is there any metrics that we can like track, or that you specifically want to look for here that would tell you that this is going to be helpful from is there anything that you can measure there that's going to tell us, hey, you're in a good spot here? Or is it just, hey, just do it, and then that's going to be the most important?
Yeah, I have most people do an assessment of VO2 max. So you can do a 2K on a Concept 2 rower. Get on, set it for 2,000 meters, row as hard as you can. There's an equation on the Concept 2 site that'll convert it. You can do a 12-minute Cooper run test. So run as hard as you can for 12 minutes exactly, relatively flat ground. see how far you can go. You can convert that to a VO2 max number. So that's what I would track first, because that's going to give you an idea. Are you really bad, okay, or are you pretty good? And what you'll find is that there is a pretty high genetic component to that. But the cool part is, up into pretty high component, it's very trainable. And in my experience, having done this with athletes and lifters for 10 plus years now, it's much more predictable than even weightlifting. Like weightlifting, the principles and the program design, I think, are predictable, but the output is so varied. Like you've got people that just look at a weight and do everything wrong and just get bigger and stronger. You've got other people where it's really hard for them to do it even when they're doing everything right. Or with aerobic training, yeah, you definitely have people that are hyper responders, but those people you'll usually find on an assessment have a really high VO2 max and don't do a lot of direct training. Or their training is reflective of a high aerobic capacity. Like they're playing a sport like soccer, or even some like very high level bodybuilders actually have a pretty good VO2 max. The intermediate ones, not so much. The horrible ones, not very good at all. So inherently, they may already have that, but you would know that by looking at how much training they do compared to their VO2 max. Like I've tested some people here and their VO2 max was 50. They didn't do any cardiovascular training. Like, what the hell? That sucks. Like you just got the genetic lottery. You look at the Heritage trial, which is done at the University of Minnesota, supports some of that. But the cool part is, even if it's low, it's very trainable. And most people with 6 months of dedicated effort can see a pretty massive difference in it. Caveat is, that's like all things. You probably need, if that was your number one goal, probably need to do it 4 to 6 days a week. Like I do think you'd make an argument for higher frequency. Doesn't mean you have to stop lifting entirely, but especially if you're in that intermediate range, it's just like anything. It's going to take some dedicated effort and programming to do it. Once you hit a better level, it doesn't take that much to maintain it, though. So that's nice.
Yeah. So it sounds like it is genetic in terms of your VO2 max, but at the same time, it is modifiable. You are able to change it, but some people just may have to do a little bit more and work a little bit harder. And then obviously, depending on how high you want to get that VO2 max, that's going to come down to, again, the time and effort that you want to put into it. And it sounds like, again, the higher you want it to be, you're going to have to put in, like you said, higher frequency from that standpoint.
Yeah, I find a rough cutoff is probably around 50 milliliters per kg per minute. If you're in the low 40s, which is okay, yeah, you could probably do 6 months to a year of pretty dedicated training. Probably hit the high 40s, maybe, depending on where you're at, what you're doing, all that kind of stuff. At least probably 45. And once you're at 50, to try to get to 55, 60, 70, that's a whole different ball game. Most of the time, you'd have to be a dedicated endurance athlete if you want to go from 50 to 70. And you may never hit that.
But from like in the research, if you can get up high, like in those 50s, 60s, 70s, like that, is that something that like you are going to continue to see improvements from like a longevity, overall health, cognitive standpoint?
Yes, but it definitely flattens out. So
Okay.
if you look at the studies, like there's been one published in JAMA that broke it up into different quartiles compared to elite level status and basically field mouse sea slug status. I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think going from the bottom quartile to just the first quartile was like a 40 or 50% increase. Going from the last one to elite level, I think was like single digits. So it does still seem to scale up. At least this is related to mortality, but it's definitely, there's very much this curvilinear approach. So just going from being horrible to not horrible, you're going to get a huge benefit. Just like lifting. If you go from 0 sets to 1 set, dude, that's like a massive difference. Like 1 set to 2 set, will you get better? Yeah. 3 set to 4 set, maybe. You're going to see this kind of effect. Nothing to something is going to be the biggest relative change, though.
Yep, that makes sense. I guess too, and again, you may have just answered this here with that, but for example, like with, let's say, muscle growth, it's, again, to get to really high levels, you're going to have to really put in the time and effort. And again, hopefully, but from my understanding, the more and more we get, and we're talking people on the extreme end here, again, they're probably on some form of PED, stuff like that. It becomes potentially be detrimental, like long-term health, right? As you get to those higher levels.
Sure.
But whereas like VO2 max, my understanding is obviously that's going to be something that you're not going to see negatives to getting it higher. It's just, again, the time aspect of it from that standpoint.
Yeah, most of the studies would say you don't see a negative impact on VO2 max. The caveat is at the high end, there is data on, I think, ultra marathon runners and ultra athletes that show detrimental cardiac formation, loss of longevity, that type of thing. Now, if I remember right, that was measured in hours training per week and per year. It wasn't measured in VO2 max per se. And my guess is that some of those athletes at some point, they're not increasing their VO2 max. They're just doing a lot of volume. And that is definitely going to be a detriment. This is not including orthopedic issues, overuse issues, etc. If you do way too much cardiovascular work, especially too much cycling, you can have cardiac changes that are not very good. If you do way too much high pressure lifting only, you can see cardiac changes that are not so good either. So on the high pressure lifting, powerlifting type side, the structure of the wall of the cardiac systems can start to get too thick because it's contracting against all of this high pressures. And then the volume of blood inside the chamber can get too small and you can run into issues. As that wall thickens, you tend to develop more scar tissue. Scar tissue is probably a way of trying to deal with that high pressure. That can result in electrical issues and some other issues. On the other end, you can have the walls can get a little bit too thin because you're just doing with these massive amounts of blood, massive amount of this diastolic stretching, and that can run into issues over time too. Again, those are like the two extremes of the extremes on both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, no, I love that. And again, and again, I could be getting this wrong, but it sounded like the big issue with that is just the amount of training that you have to do to potentially get to that point. That's going to probably be the biggest issue with that, essentially.
Yeah, elite level, like true elite level athletics does have almost nothing to do with health. But
Yep.
all things being said, if you can reach that level and be healthier, I do think that is an advantage. But at some point, to become that hyper specialized, you are
Yep.
trading things off. If you look at a high level, drugs aside, Tour de France competitor, they're low on the muscle mass for longevity, right? If you look at high level power lifter, there's exceptions, but I'd argue the aerobic stuff isn't really very good. Again, that's not their goal either.
Yeah, like you said, anytime you have pursued one thing, you become like the elite of it. It's like it's probably not the best for overall health from that perspective. So what would be, so those are your big rocks. And again, with most of this stuff, hey, you do those two things, you're going to be probably in a really good spot there from a cognitive standpoint. What would be some things that are like lower on the priority list, but you still think are helpful and maybe can help support this as well too?
There's some data on this, but I would say just different environments and different exposure. Like I'm thinking about learning a new language. I'm especially thinking about travel, like going to a different place. I'd love to see a study taking Americans and putting them in Japan for 2 weeks and seeing what changes are being made there. My guess is it's pretty high. I think they've done some studies looking at neurologic changes with like computer interactions of changing operating systems and things like that. So things that kind of get you out of your own habits. And then there is a fair amount of data on psychedelics in terms of their use of increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There's some studies on people who have used ayahuasca at high doses in other cultures where they put them in MRI and they do see more beneficial changes to their brain. We do know that after a high dose of certain compounds, potentially DMT, especially psilocybin and other 5-HT2A1 agonists, that you do have a more plastic period of maybe making faster changes to your brain. So I think in the future, currently in the US, most of these compounds are Schedule 1 illegal. But it would be interesting to see if you can open these kind of what they call critical periods, maybe, where your brain is more hyperplastic again, and then you do some type of specific training after that. Would you see a faster result? My hypothesis would be yes, because you have more hyperplasticity that you'd be able to use at that particular time. But right now, that's pretty theoretical.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. What about from any other like supplement or nutrition, like any like certain nutrients that we'd want to maybe make sure we're getting or anything like that?
Yeah, the basic stuff. I think a good multivitamin, I think, is useful. Plenty of data on fish oil, EPA, DHA. There's accumulating data, even things like blueberries, anthocyanins, and different components of that. There's accumulating data on something called astaxanthin. It's a red carotenoid that at higher doses appears to be a pretty good antioxidant. Maybe that's protecting against some oxidative damage. If I remember right, I think it does cross the blood-brain barrier. Choline sources, you can obviously have whole food sources such as egg yolks. You can get it as a supplemental form, such as CDP choline or acetylcholine. There's plenty of studies on that. You can look up some researchers, their last name is Renshaw, done a bunch of stuff on that. So those type of compounds are interesting. And then there's not as much data right now, but I would throw ketones into that mix also. Full disclosure, I do scientific advising for Tecton, who have a ready-to-drink ketone ester product that actually tastes pretty good. The nice part about ketones as a supplement, especially as an ester, you can get high levels of blood ketones. You don't necessarily have to do a ketogenic diet. So if you're really pushing cognitive stuff, I think that's a interesting area. There's mixed data on cognitive performance after high levels of stress with ketones. I would say most of it's probably positive. And if you think about what high level athletics is still trying to make pretty good decisions under high levels of fatigue. So I think there'll be more data in that area. And there's also accumulating data for ketones, post-concussion, TBI, things of that. I did a whole educational program for the Carrick Institute on that.
Interesting, especially for the concussion side of things there. What about creatine? Is that something that what
Yeah,
does that kind of stand for you?
yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I definitely throw creatine in there also. Caveat with creatine, if you're looking for cognitive stuff, we don't really know the dosage yet. It's probably higher. If you extrapolate directly from the mouse studies, which they have different creatine uptake, it appears in their brains compared to humans, so it's probably not accurate. Might be as high as 10 to 20 grams per day, but we've got pretty good studies showing creatine doesn't really have many negative side effects. Maybe a little bit of weight gain, which again is highly different per person per dose. So what I have done with athletes I consult with, again, it's up to them, but I have recommended 10 to 20 grams of creatine for maybe a couple weeks before they're going to do their football season, MMA, etc., where they know for sure they're going to have head contact and potential head trauma. Boxing, MMA, like that, literally you're trying to knock someone out. You're literally trying to induce a concussion in somebody. But yeah, and I think creatine has shown very little side effects on that. Eric Ralston has done a fair amount of research in that area too, so you can look up his stuff. And Scott Forbes has done a lot of creatine research also.
Yeah, I feel like creatine's one that's been just like popping up a lot from that standpoint, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It was like the muscle building supplement. And now all of a sudden I feel like it's all about that. And then I just told you before, we just recently had a child and wasn't getting as much sleep. And I know there's some interesting research on creatine being helpful, like under times of like some sleep deprivation as well too there. And in terms of like maintaining your kind of cognitive function from my understanding as well too.
Yeah. So if people have shift work or even new kids, if they're looking for things that are not stimulant based that may help with that, my top two would be higher dose of creatine and then some type of ketone ester.
Cool. Yeah, no, I'm not too up to date on any ketones and stuff like that. It's definitely something I need to look into a bit more. I'll have to get some info from you on that all fair.
Yeah,
so you
for
can
sure.
lead me in the direction there with that. And then obviously I know you probably left this one off because it's just so basic was sleep. I'm assuming this is one that
Oh,
people
yeah, in
probably
terms of
often
habits.
that people
Yeah.
probably often overlook. I guess then maybe that would be a good question. Any obviously sleep from any other habits or anything like that you would recommend too from a cognitive standpoint?
Yeah, sleep is huge in terms of especially acute performance, long-term performance, reduction of stress, etc. There's some interesting stuff I would say with social interactions also. Loneliness we know has had a huge negative correlation with that too. I think social interactions are something that has probably a huge positive effect. There's some early studies showing yes, but I think it's also one of those things that gets left off the list too.
People just brush the sleep under. Oh yeah, whatever. What are the supplements I can take or what's that? But it's again, you got to make sure that's the first place to look there. Cool. Yeah, no, I think cognition's super interesting, and I feel like it's just a hotter topic right now in general. Real quick before I just want to
thing on cognition too.
Yep.
There's some new studies looking at, I think they were associative, but looking at grip strength with cognition, or maybe it was neurodegeneration. I think it was, don't quote me on this, but I want to say people with a greater grip strength had almost like a 40% reduction in, I think, like cognitive decline. Obviously, I do a lot of grip stuff, but I would throw that in there too.
Do you think that probably is part just again grip strength's probably going to correlate to like strength, and then like you said, doing a lot of the things that we've already talked about too there, and that's again going to be what's at play there.
I think
that.
So. I've often said we've never met someone who has a really good grip strength that's a weak person.
Right.
Like you will meet some freaks the other direction. Like you will meet some pretty strong people who have a weak grip just from lack of training it. But I've never met the reverse. So I think the stronger your grip is, the more you can just move safely overall, because that's your interaction with the implements, assuming you're not using straps and other assisted stuff. But if we also look at like the homunculus in the brain, about how much real estate the brain maps to grip and hand and dexterity and movement and function, and it's really high. So my hypothesis is that training different functions and different aspects of grip, I think, will translate to better cognition, although I can't point to a direct cause and effect study on that.
Interesting. Yeah. So like you said, maybe it's some of that, but at the same time, it is something that you can actually train itself. And there's definitely some benefit to doing that. But like you said, you've never met someone that.
If you have a really strong grip, I can guarantee you're not a weak person.
Right. Okay. Great. Yeah. It's not the opposite, but you've seen the opposite where that has happened.
I have seen some very strong people who have a relatively weaker grip, although I would not say it's super weak, but they're very rare. And usually if you look at their training, they use a ton of straps and that kind of stuff. But compared to norms, they're definitely higher than the norms for sure.
Is there anything else on cognitive function or anything like that you want to mention, or
No, I think
anything that
that's
we missed
probably
up?
pretty good.
Cool.
Yeah.
So we don't have too much time, but I did just want to bring this up. So I was just more so curious on my end. What's the main difference between your flexibility cert versus the metabolic flexibility? Or I think that's the flex diet cert is what you call that. What are the differences between those two?
Yeah, so what I wanted to do is set up a level 1, level 2. So level 1 is the flex diet cert, which is primarily more on nutrition. But the goal was, okay, what are some of the things that people really need to focus on to get better performance and body composition? So I came up with 8 interventions for it, which is everything from protein, fats, carbohydrates, fasting, micronutrients, so NEAT, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and then sleep. So what are your big rocks? And then I have them listed in order. So you're focusing on the big ones that have what I call the most coaching leverage, which is the physiologic response times the psychological ability of the client to change. So for example, protein was number 1. Tons of physiologic reasons why eating more protein is beneficial for body comp performance, etc. And if you tell someone, hey, you're going to eat more of this one particular thing, they're like, oh, okay, cool, I can do that. Because they think you're going to tell them, oh, just avoid all these foods, don't eat all this stuff. Sleep has actually a very high physiologic impact. Clients' ability to change their sleep, yeah, it's like dead last, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It all comes down to a value judgment of, oh, so you're telling me I can't relax and watch Netflix for 2 hours a night. I'm supposed to go to bed and sleep 1 hour more or 2 hours more. At some point, yeah, once you maximize your quality of sleep, you just 4 hours a night probably is not going to cut it. So they'll get the basics of nutrition, some basic exercise in there, and then sleep. Once they're pretty good at that, I'd say I give them like a round of B or so definitely above average. The physiologic flexibility then takes the same ideas, but extends it to you as a human organism. So let's say we grade you as a B on exercise, nutrition, and sleep. What would be the next class of things to do? And how would you know what things are going to be beneficial? There's tons of biohacking things of shoving red light up your ass or whatever you need to do. But is there a system you can go through and look to see what areas, what do you need to expand? And so what I came up with is that humans have these things that are homeostatic regulators. So number 1 is temperature. We tend to keep 98.6, it's actually 97.7, but you can do cold water immersion, you can do sauna, you can put yourself in these other more extreme environments, and we know there's adaptation. You can acclimatize yourself to higher humidity, higher temperatures. So we know there's an adaptation there. We're not looking to move that underlying variable, but we're looking for you to be more robust in other extreme temperatures. And I would extend that to the 4 pillars I have are temperature, pH changes, expanded fuels, which is all the way from lactate to ketones. And number 4th would be just breathing. So carbon dioxide and oxygen regulation. Again, we're not looking to necessarily change where you're at, but we're looking to add this more physiologic buffer zone or physiologic headroom to it. And my hypothesis is if you're better across those 4 domains, you're just going to be a lot easier and have a lot better ability to recover and just generally are going to be a lot harder to kill. Like a lot of other systems that flow downstream from that are going to be much, much better off.
So essentially, I think as I was reading this, it's like just basically your body, like that's going to help your body adapt to stress and be able to recover from any type of stressor. Essentially,
yeah. Because what's interesting is that I think by targeting those areas, which are again hardwired but can be expanded, we don't know exactly all the cross adaptations there. So a couple things I found, like we've repeated this in 4 people now. Like just going into cold water immersion, your blood glucose tends to plummet and plummet pretty fast, but you don't get hypoglycemic symptoms. I don't know why that is. I don't understand all the mechanisms per se, but it seems to be metabolically, there's something going on with cold water exposure. Fat loss doesn't seem to be accelerated. Recovery is mixed. But I think on the metabolic side, there's definitely something going on there. So I think there may be a play with changes in temperature for metabolic health. We do know that there's cross adaptations in doing a cold water immersion before exposure to a hypoxic or a low oxygen environment. The group that did the cold water immersion was much more tolerant to a hypoxic environment right after. And that has to do with some of these cross adaptations in the body. So I think there's a bunch more cross adaptations that we just haven't quite figured out yet. But it just seems to be if you're very good at regulating temperature, pH, expanded fuels, like all the way from fasting to high periods of carbohydrate intake, and then regulating oxygen and CO2, I think that's going to cover you quite a ways.
Yeah, it makes you, like you said, more robust and harder to kill. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, because again, you're getting used to those conditions. And then for most people doing either whether it be fasting or getting in, maybe going outside when it's 20 degrees, it's like, that's way too, people just can't handle that type of stuff. Right. And again, I think so that makes a lot of sense. Is that something too that you feel like is adaptable as well too? Is you talk about heat, cold, stuff like that. I'm assuming we can also take this in terms of getting outside in the winter when it's super cold outside, like doing some exercise when it's like super hot outside as well too. I'm assuming that's also like what we're talking about there, or is that, or am I off on that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like you don't necessarily need, so with all the interventions, I have basically no or low tech ways to do it. So in Minnesota in the summer, one thing I would do is just take the rower and stick it out in the middle of the street and exercise outside. I train most of the time in my garage. I don't have a fan. I don't have a heater, or I have a heater in the winter, but it's the 44 degrees Fahrenheit. So getting exposure to those different temperatures, I think is good. If you look at people as they age, they tend to lose that ability to regulate their own temperature. And I do think that's a detriment to their overall physiology. And if you want to take it to the extreme, then you can work on switching. So just like metabolic flexibility, you have carbohydrates on one end, fat on one end. How fast you can switch would be the third component. So physiologic flexibility, it's the same idea. You have, say, heat exposure on one end, cold exposure on the other end. The third component is how fast can you switch between those two, which would be some type of sauna and cold water immersion or contrast type training, which again, all of these are stressors. So people have to be careful how much of this they add and when they add. And I think when you're forcing switching back and forth, if you can handle it and you can resolve those stressors, I do think that is a marker for being more resilient. But again, that's a longer term, probably many month process if people haven't been exposed to it, just like training. You've got cardiovascular aerobic adaptations on one end and strength adaptations on the other end. You can switch back and forth between the two. You're going to be much better off and more robust. So same ideas, but again, just like strength training and aerobic stuff, you can go a little bit too hog wild and definitely overstep your recovery bounds.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And again, it's just, again, I think this is interesting because it's, people get super comfortable with like just being inside and it being 70 degrees. And it's like anything outside of that, it's, oh, I can't be outside. I can't be. And I think just getting outside in general can be super helpful for overall health. And during this time of year, I just see a lot of people be like, oh, I can't get any movement in. I can't get outside because it's too cold when it's 30 degrees out. And come on, you just got to get a little uncomfortable here. You're just so used to being like so freaking comfortable inside. And then same thing in the summertime, if you have these kind of ranges of Minnesota is probably that way too, right? It gets pretty warm and then it can get pretty cold at times. And again, you hear the other excuse like, oh, it's too hot. And I just feel like we just are so used to being comfortable. And then same thing with the fasting side of things too.
Yeah. And I remember having my physiology teacher, God, probably 30 years ago, point this out. I went to school in Duluth, Minnesota, at St. Scholastica, and I'm just stuck in my head. He's, oh yeah, people definitely adapt to temperatures. I was like, what the hell is he talking about? Yeah, he's going to tell us not to use heat and air conditioning or whatever. And he's just look around campus. Like when you have the first day that it gets to 40 degrees in fall, everybody's complaining about how cold it is. You're wearing sweatshirts, but it's below zero most of the winter. And in spring, when it hits 40 degrees again, the same temperature, you're like, oh shit, it's like t-shirt weather. No sweatshirts, whatever. He's like, you adapted to that period of being cold and now you're more resilient. So that same stimulus, that same thing isn't as big of a deal as it was before.
I think the takeaway is it's just cool how adaptable the human body is. I think in our modern environment, it's so easy to think that we got to have everything be perfect. We're pretty adaptable if you just yourself adapt to things and put yourself under those stressors.
Yeah, I think the body's ability to adapt just always amazes me. So even like I worked in the cardiovascular field for a while in the med tech industry, we would see people in stage 3, stage 4 heart failure. Obviously, their heart has very poor function. And some of those people, we would put in a new device that basically resynchronized the beating of the heart from the left side to the right side. And as long as they didn't cross this kind of threshold where they had so much damage they couldn't recover from, but they could be pretty far along that path. And most of the time, the heart would remodel back to almost a normal shape again, which even the EPs, cardiologists were all like, what? We've never seen this before. This is crazy. So like giving the right stimulus, I think we underestimate how much the body can actually adapt. And so if you were to get anything, air quotes, correct in your training, I would say get the stimulus of what you want the response to be, get the stimulus correct first, and you'll get a really long ways doing that.
Yep. And I'm assuming too, like in that situation there, it's also like a lot of people think it's like too late to adapt to anything. You can probably do this really at any time, and really no matter like what health you're in. It's just like you said, you just got to make sure that stimulus is right and you're not doing like too much or anything like that too.
Yeah, and it just has to be scaled appropriately. I've worked with a few people that they've been cleared of POTS, right? So postural orthostatic intolerance, basically. Hey, get on the rower, do some light stuff for 30 seconds, get off before you get symptomatic. Or sometimes we started one per person just on the rower staring at the screen, not moving, just breathing. Like as long as you can scale it to just under where your capacity is and intelligently, slowly scale it up, like your body will almost always adapt. The biggest errors I usually see is usually just too much too soon, and then you're going to run into issues.
Yep. Too much too soon, and then maybe not enough focus on again like the sleep side stuff like that.
Oh yeah, your recovery is not a floating trash bin fire,
which I feel like a lot of people's are.
Yeah, it is.
Cool, Dr. Mike, man, really appreciate your time. We went a little over today. Appreciate you spending a little bit of extra time here. Good chat as always. I could talk to you for hours on this stuff. But before I let you go, is there anywhere where you want to lead the audience to, or anything coming out on your end that you want to lead them to?
Yeah, so best place for everything is primarily the newsletter. That's where probably like 95% of my content goes now. So you can just go to MikeTNelson.com. A little tab up at the top that's newsletter, so you can hop in there and it's free to join. And do have some stuff on Instagram once in a while. So Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and then we've got the Flex Diet certification and the PhysFlex certification. The easiest way to get more info on that is probably just through the newsletter, and you can just always hit reply once you're on the newsletter if you have any questions for me.
Awesome. Cool. Appreciate your time, and link all that in the show notes, and we'll talk with you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.